Good morning. Welcome to AMRO's press conference on the launch of the 2026 ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook, the REO. I'm Daisy Wong with AMRO's communications team. Let me introduce our speakers today, AMRO Director and CEO, Mr. Yasuto Watanabe, Chief Economist, Dr. Dong He, and Mr. Alan Ang, Group Head of AMRO's Regional Surveillance, and he is in charge of the REO. In a minute, I will invite Mr. Watanabe to deliver opening remarks, followed by a few words from Dr. He. Alan will then walk us through in a short presentation about the latest findings of the REO 2026. We'll be happy to take your questions afterwards, both online and from the journalists here in the room with us. As we speak, the embargo on the REO report has just ended at 10:30 a.m. Singapore time. Without further ado, I now invite Mr. Watanabe to give his opening remarks. Mr. Watanabe, please.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of AMRO, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the REO 2026 ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook. We meet at a difficult juncture. The conflict in the Middle East has entered its second month. It is creating one of the most significant disruptions to global energy market in decades. Trade policy uncertainty remains elevated. These shocks are reaching our region quickly, affecting the ASEAN+3 region at the same time. This makes REO 2026 particularly meaningful. This is our 10th edition. It comes at a time of the heightened uncertainty when clear and independent assessment of AMRO is quite essential. My colleague will present the findings shortly, but let me underline one point. The ASEAN+3 region entered this period from a position of strength. That strength was built over time. It reflects sound policy and a shared commitment to work together. But resilience cannot be taken for granted. It must be maintained. This is where AMRO plays its role. AMRO was created out of the region's shared experience of Asian financial crisis to conduct regional surveillance and support the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, CMIM. We provide sharp analysis, independent policy advice, and support for the regional financial cooperation. The CMIM, a US $240 billion regional financial safety net, stand ready to provide liquidity when needed. This year also marks AMRO's 10th anniversary as an independent international organization. It is a moment to reflect and look ahead. In a more volatile and uncertain global environment, our direction is clear. AMRO will continue to support our members through timely risk identification, practical policy solution, and stronger regional cooperation. Thank you very much.
Mr. Watanabe, thank you. Let me now invite Dr. He to share a few words about the regional outlook. Dr. He, over to you, please.
Thank you, Daisy. Good morning. Welcome to today's press conference for the release of AMRO's flagship report, the ASEAN+3 Economic Outlook 2026. Once again, policymakers are navigating a world battered by shock after shock. Just last year, sweeping tariffs disrupted global trade, dented confidence, and forced firms to rethink supply chains. Now, barely months later, a sharp escalation of the conflict in the Middle East has delivered the most severe energy shock in decades. For the ASEAN+3 region, the timing matters. The energy shock arrived just as the region was expecting a more balanced risk landscape and from a position of strength. Economic performance across ASEAN+3 surprised to the upside in 2025. Regional growth reached 4.3%, well above the 3.8% projected in the immediate aftermath of the April tariff shock. Inflation remained low and stable, and external buffers improved. But strength does not imply immunity. Higher oil and gas prices worsened the terms of trade for energy importing economies, reduced real incomes, and rippled through food prices, services, and manufactured goods. This combination, a negative income shock alongside higher inflation, is what makes energy shocks particularly difficult to manage. While these risks are real and should not be understated, the region confronting them today is structurally different from the one that faced earlier energy shocks. Energy required to produce a unit of GDP in the region has fallen by 20 to 30% since 2000. Power systems have diversified, and electrical vehicle adoption is accelerating. The transformation runs deeper than energy. Over the past 2 decades, regional production networks have evolved into a dense and sophisticated architecture where the technological capabilities of Japan and Korea, the dynamism of ASEAN, and the scale of China reinforce one another. The long-standing view of the region as the world's factory, producing primarily for external demand outside the region, is outdated. Increasingly, the region is producing for itself. Against such a changed structural background and stronger resilience of the region, the central policy priority for policymakers at the current conjuncture is to avoid worst-case outcomes such as stagflation. Most ASEAN+3 economies retain meaningful fiscal and monetary policy space. And the imperative now is to preserve that flexibility given the elevated uncertainty and the unusually wide range of plausible outcomes. These themes frame this year's ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook. I invite you to read the full report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. He. Next, Alan will present the REO findings. Alan, please.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Let me go straight to the presentation. I will spend about 15 minutes for this presentation. So this year's report has 2 chapters. The first one examines the region's near-term outlook, including the impact of the Middle East conflict. And the second takes a step back and examines how the region's economic linkages have transformed over the past 2 decades and why that matters for resilience and growth in the future. So let me start with our outlook. ASEAN+3 entered 2026 from a position of relative strength. Last year, growth came in stronger than expected at 4.3%, despite the largest tariff shock that we have faced since the 1930s. Now, this outperformance was driven in part by lower effective tariff rates than those announced during the Liberation Day in April last year. But more importantly, AI-driven semiconductor demand provided a strong boost to regional exports, and at the same time, domestic demand remained a key driver of growth. Household spending remained robust, and investment activity also strengthened, benefiting from broad-based FDI inflow, especially in ASEAN. And lastly, and this is less appreciated, intra-regional trade within the region actually strengthened after Liberation Day, even as our exports to the US weakened. trade within the region actually grew by more than 10% after Liberation Day. And this was not in any single direction. For example, both China's export to the rest of the region and the rest of the region's export to China expanded by more than 10% after Liberation Day. So looking ahead, growth is expected to moderate to 4% this year and next year. And inflation is forecast to increase to 1.4% this year and 1.5% in 2027. However, this baseline is subject to a wide range of uncertainties, and the overall balance of risks is tilted to the downside. Let me turn to the most pressing of this, the Middle East conflict. So, the severity of an energy shock really depends on two things. First, its scale. Secondly, its duration. On scale, this is the most significant disruption the region has faced in decades. Roughly 20% of global oil and gas trade flows through the Persian Gulf. This is 4 times the supply affected during the Russian-Ukraine conflict in 2022. And unlike that episode, this directly affects the region's own supply route. So crude oil prices have risen sharply, with Brent now trading at above $110 USD per barrel compared to $68 USD per barrel on average last year. Natural gas prices have also risen, although less sharply so. So on duration, we are now about 5 weeks in. So the scale of disruption is already clear. What will determine the severity of the economic impact is how long it persists. So our baseline assumes oil prices remain elevated at above $90 per barrel through June before moderating towards $80 per barrel in the second half of this year. Now this was broadly consistent with oil futures pricing when we finalized our forecast 2 weeks ago. But given the extreme uncertainty, we have also considered additional scenarios around this baseline. So if oil prices remain above $100 per barrel for the rest of the year, inflation could rise to 2.2% and growth slow to 3.7% for the region. This is the highest and the lowest respectively for the region since 2022. But even this model-based estimate might not capture the full extent of the impact. The longer a supply disruption persists, the more it spreads beyond energy into industrial inputs, petrochemicals, fertilizers, food prices, and broader services prices. And each layer reinforces the next, and the cumulative effect can be larger than what we have shown here. So a prolonged conflict could turn what is currently in our baseline, a manageable shock, into something that's far more difficult to contain. And the energy shock is the most immediate risk, but it's not the only one. So in our outlook, we have also considered a few other key risk drivers, including technology demand and trade policy. Now, strong AI-driven technology upcycle was an important impetus to growth last year for the region. This year, we expect continued growth, although at a more moderate pace. But if AI adoption proves to be faster or broader than expected, growth could be lifted even higher than baseline. However, on the flip side, if there's a sharp pullback in the tech cycle, we could see growth adversely affected. And changes in tariff policies, which is still very uncertain currently, could amplify these effects on both directions. But the bigger concern here is that these risks do not operate in isolation. For example, a prolonged energy shock could disrupt supply chains and dampen investment in the technology sector, while a re-escalation of tariff could compound the drag on exporters already facing higher input costs. So this is the environment that policymakers are currently facing. So what are the macro policy priorities? Most ASEAN+3 economies retain meaningful fiscal and monetary policy space. I think the key here is to deploy that space in a way that preserves flexibility, because the range of outcomes remain very wide. The central objective is to prevent a temporary shock in the baseline from becoming something worse, such as stagflation. So 3 priorities. First, in the near term, fiscal policy should provide targeted and temporary support to the most exposed households and critical sectors, not broad price suppression, such as through universal fuel subsidies, which would be costly, difficult to unwind, and could itself add to inflation. Second, monetary policy should look through the initial energy price shock, but stand ready to act decisively if inflationary pressures broaden into core prices and wages. Now, in Chapter 1 of ARIO this year, we have a special feature that examines precisely this type of challenge, how central banks can navigate monetary policy when the nature and persistence of shock is highly uncertain. Third, over the longer term, I think this episode really reinforces the importance of diversifying energy sources, accelerating the energy transition, and strengthening our structural buffers. Now, let me take a step back from the near-term outlook and move to the Chapter 2 of the ARIO. The second chapter of the ARIO asks a more fundamental question. How have the region's economic linkages evolved over the past 2 decades? And what does that mean for the region's resilience and growth in an increasingly geo-economically fragmented world? So over the last 2 decades, there have been 3 key shifts that have happened to the region when it comes to its economic linkages with each other. First, on the supply side is the formation of denser and more integrated regional supply chains. So these 2 network maps here really tells the story. In 2000, the supply chain architectures were centered on Japan, but by 2024, China has become an important hub. But this is not a story of displacement. Japan and Korea continue to provide, for example, capital goods and high-precision components, and ASEAN economies have taken on a more significant role in mid-value manufacturing. So what has happened is densification. Regional production network has become more complex and more complementary. For example, this is reflected in the composition of exports and imports between ASEAN and China. More than 90% of exports from China to ASEAN are in intermediates and capital goods, not in final consumption goods. The same is true for ASEAN exports to China too. More than 90% are in intermediates and capital goods. The second important shift is the demand side, and here is even more striking. ASEAN+3 is now collectively the largest source of final demand in the world today. And this matters because it means the region's growth is increasingly driven by its own consumption and investment, not just by producing for external market. Collectively, the region's final demand has in fact surpassed that of the US, representing a share of almost 28% in the global final demand in 2024. This compares to 23% for the US. And within the region is also the largest final demand market for itself. We are more dependent on each other's final demand today than ever before. For example, again, let's consider ASEAN and China. China is the single biggest source of final demand for ASEAN, and it has grown significantly, almost 4-fold since 2000. But importantly, this is not unidirectional. ASEAN collectively is also now the second largest source of final demand for China after the US, with a share that has grown more than 3-fold since 2000. Now, the last important shift is in investment flow, which has reinforced the previous trade and demand shifts. More than 1/5 of global FDI is directed to the region, and nearly half of the FDI stock in the region is sourced from regional economies itself. Within the region, China, including Hong Kong, has become a more significant capital exporter. So to summarize the shift, the region has moved from an externally oriented model with limited intra-regional demand to one that is with denser supply chains, even inward-anchored demand, and this was accompanied by reinforcing investment flows, basically a more regionally anchored ASEAN+3. The natural next question is, what does this mean for policies? Now, there are 2 key policy implications. The first is conjunctural. Our business cycles have become more synchronized within the region, and our analysis shows that since 2016, regional factors have grown in importance, and outside of crisis periods, on the right-hand side, it explains roughly as much as the region's growth variance as global factors. And this is not coincidental. Our econometric work confirms that global value chain or GVC participation, as well as FDI linkages, are the key drivers of this increased synchronization. The second implication is longer term. Now, we can map economies along 2 dimensions, the value-added content of the export and their concentration risk. So ideally, you would want to be on the top left quadrant, higher value added and lower concentration. But what our data shows is that many ASEAN economies did move upward towards higher value added, but also rightward towards a higher concentration risk. So the very process of upgrading through deeper regional linkages has also increased the exposure to a narrower set of partners and sectors, so increase the concentration risks. So overall, deeper integration has brought clear benefits. It buffers external shocks, it enables internal supply chain diversification, and it drives productivity gains. But on the flip side, it also means that shocks originating within the region now propagate more quickly, and that concentration risk has risen alongside value-added gains. This brings us to the policy question. How should the region manage these trade-offs? On the cyclical side, three things. First, greater synchronization means sound domestic macroeconomic management is no longer a domestic concern. It is a regional public good. Instability in one economy now transmits more quickly to others. Second, relatedly, this raises the value of regional dialogue. Third, global factors still matter, so preserving policy flexibilities and buffers remains essential. Now, on the structural side, also three things. First, continue to upgrade domestic capabilities, especially through investment in innovation and human capital. Second, diversify to reduce concentration risk. Third, inclusion, to ensure that integration gains are broadly shared across workers, firms, and regions. Now, in Chapter 2, we also have another special feature, and this one explores one particularly important dimension of this in regional interlinkages. That is on how ASEAN can deepen regional integration by leveraging on its existing value chain linkages to build domestic capabilities and also to strengthen intra-ASEAN investment. So let me conclude with a summary. So for the near term, the Middle East conflict has shifted the risk balance for the region decisively to the downside. But ASEAN+3 is not facing this shock from a position of weakness. For the longer term, the structural transformation that we have seen in the region's economic linkages provides the region a foundation for its resilience and long-term growth that did not exist a generation ago. Now, I would encourage you to read the full report, including the special features in each chapter. They go through considerably more insights than could be covered in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for your presentation. We will now open the floor for questions. Please continue to send us questions using the chat box. We'll try to answer as many as possible. Let us start with a question pre-submitted to AMRO. ASEAN+3 sources over 1/3 of its oil and gas from the Middle East. How does the current energy shock affect economies differently across the region?
Thank you, Daisy. Let me take that question. So as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the energy shock presents it's a supply shock, and it worsens the terms of trade for net oil importers. So when we think about the impact on the region as a whole and on the individual economies, we need to think about, of course, the duration of the conflict, how oil prices will evolve in the period ahead. Of course, it has already moved up significantly since the outbreak of the conflict. When we make forecasts or projections, we have to make certain assumptions. Particularly, a critical variable here is oil and gas prices in the period ahead. Now, we are guided by the futures market, so that's what the markets are telling us. For example, at the moment, oil Brent, the international benchmark price for Brent has moved to about $115, $16, and the futures curve tells us that it's going to come down to around from the peak in August, and then come down to below around $80 later in the year. Now, so we have, when we closed the forecast about 2 weeks ago, we assumed that for the year as a whole, on average, it will be $85. And now, since the 2 weeks has passed, now it's about $6 higher, so it's about $91 average for the year. And that would, of course, change our baseline a little bit, but not too significantly. So let me give you two numbers in terms of the so-called elasticity. That is how the change in oil prices affect our growth and prices. So the growth impact tends to be smaller. As I mentioned earlier, the energy intensity of producing a unit of GDP in the region has come down significantly in the past 25 years. So a $10 oil price shock would reduce the region's GDP by 0.1 percentage point. But it would increase inflation by about 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points. So the inflation impact is a little higher. So that's at the regional level. But for individual economies, so that depends really on the mix of energy sources for production, for consumption in the individual economies, their exposure to the Middle East, to the Strait of Hormuz passage, and of course, to the starting position, where the economy was when the conflict broke out. So let me give you a couple of examples. Now, in Northeast Asia, Japan and Korea are quite dependent on oil and gas imports from the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz. But on the plus side, they have very large strategic reserves, so that could cushion the impact. China has a much more diversified energy sources. So China, the use of renewables has increased remarkably in the past decade. And it also relies a bit more on coal than oil and gas. So that would, again, cushion the impact. In ASEAN, the Philippines is very dependent on oil and gas import from the Middle East. More than 90% come from that region. So it's a bit more dependent on that. Other economies, for example, Singapore has a more diversified sources of imports. Now, in terms of starting position, as I mentioned earlier, some of the economies start from a position of very low inflation. The region as a whole has stable and low inflation. For example, for Thailand is quite dependent on oil and gas imports as well. But its inflation was very low last year. So in that sense, it could let prices go up without necessarily reacting from a monetary policy point of view. So from that point of view, they can, the policy side, there's some room to react to this inflationary impact. In some other economies like the Philippines, inflation is a bit at a higher edge of the target range. So maybe policy is a little bit more constrained on that side. So is Japan's. Japan's inflation is a little higher than the BOJ target. So any further increase might create more pressure from the policy side. So when we analyze the impact on individual economies, I think all economies have some vulnerabilities, but as a whole, I think many economies still has a lot of policy space to deal with them.
Thank you, Dr. He. Since we have a few journalists in the room with us, let me see if I invite some of them to ask questions. So you might identify your name and organization, please.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm from CMG. I'm Liu Chang, based in Singapore. And I have two questions. The first is about the Middle East conflict. The report predicts that the regional economy will grow by 4% this year and next year. So if the Middle East conflict persists, can the regional economy achieve such growth? And what long-term impacts will the Middle East conflict have? And the second question is about the Chinese economy. And given that ASEAN+3 growth is increasingly driven by intra-regional demand and AI-related industries and so on, so what are the key growth drivers of China's economy in 2026? And how will they support the regional growth? Thank you.
Right. Thank you. These are very important questions. As I mentioned, the projection of 4% growth for the region as a whole is based on the assumption, our baseline assumption of about $85 of oil prices on average for the year as a whole. So it will come down from the peak about the middle of the year. So that's the kind of projection. But as Alan's presentation showed, that if the conflict lasts longer than we assumed and price trajectory is higher, that would of course dampen growth momentum and raise inflation even higher. So for example, in the uncontrolled regional widening conflict, Brent oil prices would be more than $100 on average for the year, and that would really dampen growth by 0.3 percentage point lower, and inflation will be much higher. It will be raised by 0.8 percentage point. So that's the kind of scenario. That would mean regional inflation will be even higher. Will be the highest since 2022, since the Ukraine-Russia war. So in that kind of situation, I think policymakers will need to take more significant policy responses. But as I mentioned, the region really entered this conflict from a position of strength. So there is quite a bit of policy room. Now, in the second question for China, China, in 2025, the growth was very steady. It had 5% growth, and now we are projecting 4.5% as a baseline. It's a bit at the lower end of the government's target range, but we think it's achievable. And it's going to be driven by steady consumption growth. And of course, external sector was a bright spot last year. We expect that will continue to be strong, maybe moderating a bit from last year. But investment can be expected to pick up as we are seeing signs of stabilization in the property sector, particularly in the first tier and the second tier cities. I think the housing market is normalizing, and maybe more policy effort should be taken to resolve the housing overhang, the legacy unsold stock in the third and the fourth tier cities. So with those policies, and of course continued innovation in the emerging sectors, we think China could still provide an important support for regional growth. That's, as we explained Alan's presentation, China is now the largest source of demand for ASEAN economies, and ASEAN itself is the second largest source of final demand for China. So continued regional integration would be important for both ASEAN and China.
Thank you, Dr. He. We got a couple more questions on our growth forecast for the region. A question from Dow Jones. In January, AMRO said it expects 2026 growth for the ASEAN+3 region to be 4%. In the latest report today, it also says AMRO expects growth in 2026 and 2027 to be at 4%. Why is there no change in forecast despite the Mideast conflict? The question from Dow Jones on
January forecast. I think we have. Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. So in January, AMRO said it expects 2026 growth for the ASEAN+3 region to be 4%. In the latest report today, it also says AMRO expects growth in 2026 and 2027 to be at 4% as well. Why is there no change in forecast despite the Middle East conflict?
Right, okay. So this chart is, as you can see, that in January 2026 update, we have 4.4%, and now we have ARIO at 4% too. So of course, this means there are offsetting forces at work, right? So in January, before the outbreak of the Middle East conflict, we saw a much more balanced risk landscape, as I mentioned earlier. So we saw significant dynamism in AI-related exports. As you all know, ASEAN+3 is really at the center of the global AI boom in terms of electronics and electrical products that are very much related to AI demand. FDI into the region in 2025 was growing at 24%. So we were expecting that this trend would continue in January. So we saw quite a bit of upside risk on the external demand side. But of course now that momentum, and of course at that moment we also expect the U.S. tariffs continue to be a downside risk, even though the negotiations and the bilateral agreements led to an outcome that was not as bad as back in the spring 2025. The tariffs situation facing the region could still present a significant downside risk. Now the risk landscape now has shifted to the downside simply because of the Middle East conflict. And that would offset some of this upside risk. So if you want to ask in terms of the baseline, we have not changed, but our risk landscape has shifted definitely more to the downside. So that's probably really the significant change we have seen since the last update.
Right.
Alan, do you have anything to
Yeah, if I can just add on is that a lot of things have happened between when we updated our January update and now. So I think one of the key things that happened after the January update, before the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, is that the actual outturn on growth in many of our economies has actually been stronger than expected. So without the Middle East conflict, our forecast would have been higher than 4%. We would have upgraded our forecast. So, but with the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, is now lower. I think what we have seen is that we have also upgraded our inflation forecast by 0.2% for the year, given our new baseline for oil prices now. So really, it's not that we didn't change our growth forecast, it's that a lot of things happened. So it would have been higher if the Middle East conflict has not occurred.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. And I think there's another related question from Malaya from the Philippines. I want to ask about the worst case scenario. So may we know the worst case scenario that AMRO is entertaining right now, given the uncertainty of the Middle East conflict? How bad can it derail the economic activity in the region, particularly for those that mainly import their energy requirements, the worst case scenario?
So the worst case scenario, of course, as I mentioned, it could be a stagflation scenario, in the sense that when inflation goes up outside the range, for example, of central bank's target, then the central banks will, and particularly if they see this shock persists well into the rest of the year, then they will, because of their mandate, they will need to start tightening monetary policy. That would worsen the growth outlook. As I mentioned earlier, the direct impact of this energy shock is larger on inflation rather than growth. But with the duration lasts longer, we could see non-linearity in our forecast, in the sense that the impacts could become bigger because there will be generalized inflationary pressures feeding into industrial inputs, and wage pressures may become more significant as well. So in that sort of situation, it could tip the economy into a recession. So policy challenges are quite significant because on the one hand, inflation is probably outside the target range, is higher than the target. And on the other hand, growth maybe goes into negative territory. So that kind of situation would be a worst case scenario. But as I mentioned earlier, the regional economies do have a meaningful amount of policy space. So I think a priority at the moment is to provide targeted support to most vulnerable sectors to secure energy supply, to provide support to the most vulnerable sectors, but also continue to preserve that flexibility just in case the situation becomes even worse. So we still have policy space to prevent such worst outcomes. But even in our scenario, as I mentioned, the scenario of average oil prices in a year averaging more than $100, we are not predicting a stagnation scenario. That's not our forecast. The region would still be able to grow, and the inflation is not in a sort of out of control scenario. So we don't see that worst outcome as part of the scenario analysis yet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ellen, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing I would add on to that is that the situation is highly uncertain. So in the scenarios that we built in, that is not the worst case scenario. We're not trying to provide a bound of what is worse and what is better. I think we try to provide a sense of how if the conflict proceeds in certain manner, what will be the likely oil prices and what will be the likely impact on our economy. As Dr. He has already mentioned, I think the range of outcomes is very wide, and there is a lot of uncertainties in our forecast. So this should not be interpreted as the worst case scenario. It's different scenarios depending on the nature of the conflict.
Okay, a question from RTM Malaysia. What are the main triggers that could cause regional growth forecasts of 4% to be revised lower? For economies such as Malaysia that remain reliant on external trade and technology demand, what policy response would be most appropriate if a prolonged conflict pushes inflation higher and starts to weigh on more visibly on growth? So it wants to ask about the policy response. Let me repeat. What are the main triggers that could cause regional growth forecasts to be revised lower? For economies such as Malaysia that remain reliant on external trade and technology demand, what policy response would be most appropriate if a prolonged conflict pushes inflation higher and weigh on growth?
Alan, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I think for the region, I think we have presented some of the key factors that will really affect growth. I think the Middle East conflict and how prolonged the increase in oil prices and how that could eventually perhaps cascade to other things beyond energy, such as industrial inputs and so on. And those would really put a downward pressure on growth in the region and upward pressure on inflation. I think for the case of Malaysia, Malaysia is not immune to this situation. But at the same time, we also want to actually present that there are two-sided risks to this outlook, especially from the case of technology. I think the information that we have gotten so far is that even in the first quarter, the technology sector continued to perform relatively well. Of course, this data is the conflict in Iran. So this could actually, if it's stronger than expected, it could actually provide some uplift to growth for the region, including for Malaysia, given that Malaysia is very much part of the supply chain for the that's benefiting from the AI-driven demand. Of course, tariff is still very uncertain. Now we have a situation in which tariff rate is about, the effective rate for the region is about 12.5. We have 10% global import surcharge by the US, and that expires in July. So there is a degree of uncertainty. What will be replaced? What will replace that 10% global import surcharge? Of course, there are also sectoral tariff and so on. So trade policy itself could be another risk that could affect the growth outlook. Now, in terms of Malaysia specifically, for policy, it's the same as what we have highlighted in terms of the initial stage is really to provide targeted support for households and sectors that are most affected, and for monetary policy to be cautious in the sense that if the increase in inflation spread beyond energy sector to second round effect and to wages and so on, and there's a case for a monetary policy to step in. But I think for the case of Malaysia, I think it's the situation is also an opportunity. The current situation is also a reform window that is presented to Malaysia. I think when global energy price rise, the fiscal cost of a broad-based subsidies rises with them. I think making better targeting not just desirable but increasingly necessary. So the opportunity, I think, is here for Malaysia to use this moment to improve subsidy design, protect vulnerable households more efficiently, and strengthen the quality and credibility of fiscal consolidation. Let me end here. Thanks.
Thank you. We also got quite a bit of country questions. Let me go into the country questions. Philippines first, and then we will go to Vietnam. There's a question from ABS-CBN of the Philippines. How is the oil crisis seen to impact the Philippines economy? Will inflation hit double digits? We also got two related questions from two other Philippines media, including Manila Bulletin. AMRO's growth forecast for the Philippines for 2026 is unchanged from its January outlook. Is the Philippines expected to emerge unscathed from the energy shock? And how would you assess the Philippines' vulnerability to energy shock, given its heavily reliant on imported oil? So few questions on the Philippines.
Take the question Vietnam.
Sure. So which one should I take first? I think
oil crisis impact to the economy.
So our forecast, I think what we in our assessment, again, I think maybe I'll start with the second question first. I think it's we are not forecasting, the forecast for 5.3 is the same as what it was in January, not because we didn't incorporate the impact of the situation in Iran. Is that a lot of things that happened between January and now. I think there was strong momentum in growth in the Philippines prior to the escalation of the conflict, and it's driven a lot by domestic demand activities. So what we have seen is that if the Iran conflict has not occurred, growth could have been higher for the case of the Philippines. And again, the Philippines is one of the more exposed economies in our region. 98% of its oil and gas imports are from the Middle East. And so we are expecting in our baseline for inflation to trend upwards. Inflation is to rise to 3.9% in 2026, not double digit. But risks are clearly tilted to the downside if oil prices rise further and disruption become more prolonged. I think the key point that we wanted to highlight is the fact that in this environment, the policy priority is really to stop a supply-driven shock from becoming broader and more persistent. That means staying alert for second round effect, with monetary policy remaining cautious and fiscal policy focused on timely, well-targeted support for the most exposed sectors and households.
Okay. Philippine Daily Inquirer wants to ask about the monetary policy in the Philippines. Do you still see some space for the BSP to further cut rates, or is the start of the tightening cycle imminent? How will the Middle East conflict shape monetary policy in the Philippines?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, that's from Philippine Daily Inquirer. Do you still see some space for the Philippine Central Bank to cut?
Do we still see what?
Do you still see some space? Space for the Philippine Central Bank to further cut rates, or is it the start of the tightening cycle imminent?
Right. So we don't see space for cutting rates at the moment because we see upside risks to inflation in the Philippines, right? We are forecasting a significant rise from 1.7% in 2025 to 3.9%. So I think this is a supply shock, as I mentioned. So the policy advice is really to probably wait and see how long the shock would last. I think it's the persistence of the shock that matters. If the persistence is longer than expected, then of course, and we see continued inflationary pressures, the central bank may need to react because it has a inflation target range of 1% plus and minus is around the 3% target. So if it goes out of the range, then there may be a need to review, particularly if the shock is expected to last longer, and then the central bank may need to tighten, and that's the framework that's in place. But again, as Alan also mentioned earlier, the Philippines economy was performing quite well last year. It has entered this period in a pretty healthy condition. So we are confident that the economy can manage this shock. It has policy space. Over the longer term, of course, there are more structural challenges that the economy need to face, particularly to strengthen its capacity to deal with shocks like climate change. But in terms of energy related, I think it's important to diversify source of energy imports, and those policy measures would help the economy to withstand future shocks.
Okay, thank you. A question on Vietnam from Bloomberg Business Week, Vietnam. What factors underpin AMRO's forecast that Vietnam will be one of the region's top performing economies this year? And what are the most notable risks the country should watch out for?
So Vietnam was the fastest growing economy last year in 2025, and we expect that it will continue to be the fastest growing economy in 2026, despite the shocks. So last year, Vietnam handled the tariff shock quite well. And this year, we expect a moderation from the 8% growth from last year, but still it's quite close to its potential. So we expect that the output gap will be pretty much closed this year. In terms of the risks, of course, Vietnam last year, I think, stood out because the US market was its largest export destination, and the reciprocal tariffs presented an important downside risk. As I mentioned, they handled that shock quite well. In the end, the outcome, of course, was not as bad as we feared. And this year, I think at the moment, the Middle East conflict and energy shock presented a more significant risk than the continued uncertainty in the tariffs. On that front, we are going to see some upside risk to the inflation. As I mentioned, I think our baseline forecast is about a 0.5 percentage point rise in inflation, and there could be a bit more upside if oil prices continue to rise. For the Vietnamese economy as a whole, actually we have just concluded our annual consultation visit with Vietnam, and we had very productive discussions with the authorities. As the economy is closing its output gap, we feel it's time for both monetary policy and fiscal policy to move from expansionary policy stance to a neutral stance, at least, and that would position the authorities well to deal with any upside risk to inflation or downside risk to growth. Credit growth was quite brisk. Was growing quite fast last year, and there are incipient signs of risk accumulation. So a more neutral policy stance and the tighter macroprudential oversight on lending, particularly to the real estate sector, I think this would contain the risks, prevent macrofinancial risks from growing, and that would position the Vietnam economy quite well for any further escalation of the Middle East conflict or upside risks to energy prices. So let me stop there. Overall, Vietnam is doing really well. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me open the floor and see if we have other questions from journalists here. Would you please identify your name and organization?
I'm Shu Chang from Xinhua News Agency. So in your report, you mentioned that there is a major shift in the supply chains of ASEAN+3 in the past 2 decades, with China becoming a prime hub and also increasing interdependence among countries. So in today's context, where supply chains are being tested by intensifying geopolitical tensions, what does this shift mean for the region and also for the world in terms of stabilizing supply chains? And have you seen any good practices in recent months? Thank you.
Alan, would you like to take that question?
Sure.
You can supplement, please.
Yeah. So I think our key, from our thematic chapter in chapter 2, I think our key message is that this shift is actually creating both real opportunities for the countries for the economies in the region, as well as it presents also some risks in terms of concentration, in terms of synchronization. I think when we contextualize it to the global environment, it is a source of resilience for the region in the sense that now we are less reliant on external demand. So stronger regional integration actually provides a buffer when it comes to us actually being the source of demand for ourselves. So I think that is a source of resilience. I think the key issue going forward is whether this integration is actually accompanied by resilience in terms of our ability to manage the trade-off that comes with stronger integration. So I think if you could move to the next slide, I think this is our policy recommendation, is that for the near term, we really need to manage the synchronization risk that it comes with closer integration. But in the longer term, I think we need to maximize the opportunities that this shift has given us to move up value chain, to provide stronger sources of income growth and productivity growth. At the same time, to also diversify, to reduce concentration risk, and more importantly, I think to also make sure that this shift is actually accompanied by more inclusive development, inclusive growth for the broader population.
Thank you, Alan. Let me just add to that. I think what we are emphasizing is that for the supply chain to be resilient, it's important for all the economies involved to increase their domestic value-added content. That means to have spillovers, more positive spillovers from FDI into the domestic economy. So the domestic value-added content in exports will become more resilient. And domestic firms in ASEAN in particular can benefit from this sort of supply chain integration by upgrading their domestic capacity. As you understand, since you are from China, Chinese experience, for example, in the 90s and the 2000s, are very illustrative in the sense that they made good use of technological transfers from FDI, from the United States and Europe, and that the positive spillovers helped domestic industries grow. Local innovations were fostered in that process. And we would like to see similar processes going on, for example, in particular in ASEAN. So we have this special feature in the chapter arguing that it's important for ASEAN to be more integrated, to increase the scale of its markets, for production networks to be distributed across ASEAN, so domestic firms can grow in ASEAN, and we would like to see more champions of ASEAN firms. That would increase the resilience of the whole region. Thank you.
Okay, let me go into some online questions on Malaysia and Cambodia. Xinqiu Daily, how does AMRO assess Malaysia's resilience compared to other ASEAN+3 economies amid the rising global trade fragmentation? Xinqiu, another question from Xinqiu. How does AMRO assess Malaysia's vulnerability once government subsidies are gradually withdrawn?
I'll take this. So I think for the case of Malaysia, the near-term baseline outlook that we have is pretty much in line with the forecast that was just released by the Malaysian authority. We are looking at 4.6% this year. But I think over the longer term, Malaysia, in the case that we are trying to make in our second chapter is really that Malaysia can be very well placed to actually continue to keep up the momentum from growth by actually leveraging on its linkages with the rest of the region, especially with regards to actually how to translate the FDI that the Malaysia is getting into something more durable, something that can actually spread and improve productivity. I think that's key. I think when it comes to the case of subsidy, withdrawal of subsidy we do not see as a source of vulnerability. In fact, the situation now provides a case for reform in the broad-based in the subsidy mechanism that is in place. I think it's providing Malaysia a window of opportunity to actually really think seriously how to actually improve the subsidy design and actually to move from something that's more targeted and more efficient.
Okay. Some questions on Cambodia, but I think we're running out of time, so last country questions. What factors, from Khmer Times, what factors will most determine whether Cambodia can achieve AMRO's projected 4.9% growth in 2026? So what factors would help achieve the growth? As a net fuel importer, how can Cambodia enhance energy security amid global price volatility and evolving regional dynamics while ensuring affordable supply? So energy security for Cambodia and the factors for it to achieve its growth.
Thank you, Daisy. For Cambodia, Cambodia last year also managed the tariff shock very well. The U.S. is its largest market, so I think the outcome, the growth outcome last year was quite strong, and that's no small achievement given the large shock. I think for this year, the factors that would would support its achieving the forecast we have here, of course, is that to continue to manage the external side well, and we see that risk is less prominent than the energy shock at the moment. So that's the second part of the question. Really, for Cambodia, I think it's important to continue to diversify its energy sources and continue to increase the strength of infrastructure. I think that's an important policy, longer-term policy goal that would support better value added, higher domestic content, of higher domestic value added in FDI investments, and that would provide the economy more resilience. Stop there.
Thank you. I think we'll take the last question from Xinqiu Daily on regional resilience. With rising geopolitical tensions and energy-related uncertainties, what strategies should ASEAN+3 governments prioritize to strengthen regional resilience and safeguard growth? What strategies should governments prioritize to strengthen regional resilience and safeguard growth?
So let me start. I think we have been elaborating on this point, but maybe Alan can also supplement. I think we can talk about the cyclical, from a cyclical point of view, or short-term priorities and the longer-term priorities. In the short term, I think we have made a strong point that's preserving flexibility in the near term and stand ready to respond decisively should the conflict impact deepen. That's really the sort of the key message we want to deliver. And as we mentioned, the region really entered into this conflict, this episode of energy shock, from a position of strength. There is meaningful policy space, but that space should be used wisely. From a monetary policy point of view, at the moment we can wait and see how persistent this energy shock will be, and then we can decide how strong the reaction should be, depending on whether the initial round of price impact will spill over into wages, would affect demand. So that's the second round impact would be important to watch. For this fiscal policy, we want to avoid broad-based suppression of price signals, but provide targeted support for the most exposed sectors, and of course to secure energy supply. So these are the short-term policy response. The longer-term resilience really, as we mentioned here in the slide, is really diversify energy and the input sources, accelerate the energy transition. As we mentioned, this green transition is not really just an environmental imperative, it's also a macroeconomic resilience imperative. And we want to also strengthen further regional integration, and that would be a way to strengthen resilience to further shocks. Thank you. Anything?
Yes, so next Monday, AMRO will be releasing the ASEAN+3 fiscal policy report as well, where we go through more specifically on our assessment and also recommendation from the perspective of fiscal policy. So do stay tuned on this report that's coming out next week. I think just to add on is that I think the near term, what this is actually a supply shock, but over time it becomes a test of resilience. I think the issue is not how large not just about how large the immediate hit is, but whether economies are prepared for the shock that could broaden, persist, and interact with other vulnerabilities. I think that's the reason why we frame the policy priority in terms of flexibility and preparedness, that the immediate task is actually to preserve stability and contain spillover, but the medium-term task is actually to use this moment to strengthen reforms and reduce vulnerability before the next shock arrives.
Thank you. We've got quite a bit of questions, but I'm afraid we have to conclude today's press conference here. For more details, you may make use of the QR code on this screen to download the AMRO report. You may also find the full range of AMRO content on the AMRO website. Thank you once again for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you for the insights of Mr. Watanabe, Dr. He, and Ellen. Thank you very much.